On a crisp autumn morning at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, the sun had barely risen when Dr. Angelique Richardson arrived with her sleek leather briefcase and carry-on luggage. As one of the country's leading neurosurgeons and the newly appointed head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, she was accustomed to early morning flights. However, this particular morning would prove to be unlike any other in her 15-year career. The private jet terminal buzzed with its usual quiet efficiency. Well-dressed businesspeople and the occasional celebrity moved through security with practiced ease, their passages smoothed by staff who recognized them from frequent flights. Dr. Richardson approached the counter, her hospital ID and flight documentation ready. She needed to reach Baltimore quickly for an emergency surgery on a 6-year-old patient with a brain tumor. "Good morning," she said, placing her credentials on the counter. "I'm Dr. Richardson. I believe everything has been arranged for my flight to Baltimore." The receptionist's fingers flew across the keyboard, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, Dr. Richardson. The hospital made the arrangements. Your pilot should be here shortly to escort you to the aircraft." As she waited in the luxurious terminal lounge, Dr. Richardson reviewed her patient's latest scans on her tablet. The surgery ahead would be challenging, the type of procedure that had earned her recognition as a pioneer in minimally invasive pediatric neurosurgery. Her concentration was broken by approaching footsteps. "I'm looking for the passenger to Baltimore," announced a middle-aged man in a pilot's uniform, his captain's stripes gleaming under the terminal lights. Dr. Richardson stood, gathering her belongings. "That would be me. Dr. Richardson." The pilot's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then more notably as his eyes traveled from her face to her credentials, then back again. He cleared his throat. "There must be some mistake. I'm expecting an executive from Johns Hopkins." "Yes, that's correct," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, having encountered similar situations before. "I'm the chief of pediatric neurosurgery. There's an emergency case waiting for me." The pilot's face hardened. "Ma'am, this is a private medical transport arranged specifically for the head of pediatric neurosurgery. Perhaps you're confused about your flight arrangements?" Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. "I assure you, I am exactly who I say I am. Would you like to see my hospital ID again? Or perhaps you'd prefer to call the hospital directly?" "Listen," the pilot said, lowering his voice, "these flights are reserved for senior medical personnel. I can't just take the word of anyone who shows up claiming to be a department head. Do you understand my position?" The terminal had grown quieter, other travelers and staff trying not to stare while clearly aware of the unfolding situation. Dr. Richardson felt the familiar weight of these moments, the ones where she had to navigate other people's preconceptions while lives literally hung in the balance. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Dr. Williams?" "Yes, I'm at Teterboro, but we seem to have a situation. The pilot is refusing to acknowledge my credentials." "Yes, I understand. Would you mind speaking with him?" She held out the phone to the pilot, who reluctantly took it. As he listened, his face began to pale. Dr. Richardson could hear the sharp tone of the hospital administrator on the other end, followed by what sounded like the chief of surgery joining the call. The pilot's demeanor transformed as he learned exactly who he had been dismissing, not just the head of pediatric neurosurgery, but a surgeon who had pioneered 3 groundbreaking procedures, whose research had saved countless children's lives, and who had been featured in medical journals worldwide. More immediately relevant, she was needed urgently in Baltimore, where a young patient's life hung in the balance. There seems to have been a misunderstanding," the pilot stammered, handing the phone back. "Please, Dr. Richardson, let me help you with your bags." But Dr. Richardson was already moving past him toward the terminal exit, her mind on the child waiting in Baltimore. "We've wasted enough time," she said firmly. "The priority now is getting to that operating room." As they walked across the tarmac, the pilot attempted to make conversation, perhaps trying to smooth over his earlier behavior. Dr. Richardson responded with brief, professional courtesy, her thoughts already in the operating room, mentally preparing for the delicate procedure ahead. What the pilot didn't know was that this incident would soon reach the desks of both the airline's executives and the hospital's board of directors. It would spark a larger conversation about prejudice in professional settings and lead to significant changes in how medical transport services operated. But for Dr. Richardson, none of that mattered in the moment. She had a young patient to save, and that would always be her primary focus. The private jet's engines were already warming up as they approached, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the tarmac. Another crew member emerged to assist with her luggage, having been briefed about the situation through his headset. The embarrassment on his face suggested he had heard everything. As Dr. Richardson settled into her seat, she pulled out her patient's files again. She had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and she had a job to do. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, professional but subdued, announcing their departure to Baltimore. They were already 20 minutes behind schedule, 20 minutes that Dr. Richardson would have to make up for when they landed. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. In 3 hours, she would be in an operating room, doing what she did best, saving lives. That's what mattered. That's what had always mattered. The rest was just noise, the kind of noise she had learned to tune out long ago, channeling her energy instead into breaking barriers and pushing the boundaries of medical science. The jet began to taxi, and Dr. Richardson opened her eyes, ready to review her surgical plan one more time. She had a feeling this story wasn't over, but for now, she had more important things to focus on. The flight to Baltimore was smooth, but for Dr. Richardson, every minute felt crucial. As the private jet descended through the morning clouds, her phone buzzed with updates from the surgical team. They had everything prepared for her arrival, the operating room was ready, the surgical tools laid out, and the young patient, 6-year-old Amy Chen, was being prepped for surgery. Upon landing, Dr. Richardson found a hospital car waiting on the tarmac, a rare accommodation that spoke to the urgency of the situation. As she stepped off the plane, the pilot, who had remained unusually quiet during the flight, finally spoke up. Dr. Richardson, he called after her, his voice carrying a weight of realization. I wish you the best with the surgery. She turned briefly, nodding professionally before entering the waiting vehicle. The driver, recognizing the precious cargo of both the doctor and time itself, navigated through Baltimore's morning traffic with skilled efficiency. At Johns Hopkins, Dr. Richardson moved through the halls with purposeful strides, her mind already cycling through the procedure ahead. Staff members nodded respectfully as she passed, many aware of the morning's events through the rapid-fire gossip network that existed in every hospital. But none of that mattered now, there was work to be done. In the preparatory room, Dr. Richardson found Amy's parents, their faces etched with worry. Mrs. Chen clutched her husband's hand, their eyes lighting up with hope as Dr. Richardson entered. They had specifically requested her, having researched extensively after their daughter's diagnosis. The surgery she was about to perform was a procedure she had pioneered, one that offered the best chance for their daughter's recovery. Dr. Richardson, Mrs. Chen said, standing quickly. We were so worried when we heard there was a delay. Everything is fine now, Dr. Richardson assured them, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had helped countless families through similar moments. Amy is in excellent hands. Let me walk you through what we're going to do today. As she explained the procedure, using simple terms that helped ease their anxiety, Dr. Richardson couldn't help but think about how many other qualified professionals might have been denied their chance to help others due to prejudice. But those thoughts would have to wait. Right now, Amy needed her full attention. The surgery lasted 6 hours, every minute requiring intense concentration and precision. Dr. Richardson's technique, which she had refined over years of practice, allowed for minimal invasion while maximizing tumor removal. As she worked, the operating room staff moved in perfect synchronization with her, many having specifically requested to be part of her team. Meanwhile, outside the operating room, the morning's incident had begun to create waves. The hospital's chief administrator had received a formal complaint from the airline company, apologizing for their pilot's behavior. What they didn't expect was the response they received: a detailed account of similar incidents reported by other medical professionals, complete with documentation and dates. By the time Dr. Richardson completed the surgery, successfully removing Amy's tumor while preserving all critical brain functions, her experience at Teterboro had become more than just another anecdote about prejudice in professional settings. It had become a catalyst for change. As she scrubbed out, Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues across the country. The story had spread, resonating with many who had faced similar situations. But her focus remained on her patient. She had promised Amy's parents good news, and she was about to deliver it. Walking into the waiting room, she found the Chens accompanied by the hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. Thompson. His presence was unusual for a post-surgery consultation, but she understood why when she saw the document in his hands. The surgery was completely successful, she announced to the parents first, watching relief flood their faces. Amy responded excellently to the procedure. She's in recovery now, and you'll be able to see her soon. After spending time answering the Chen's questions and ensuring they understood the recovery process, Dr. Richardson turned to Dr. Thompson. His expression suggested there were other matters to discuss. In his office, Dr. Thompson didn't waste time. The board has been discussing implementing new transportation protocols for our staff, he began. Your experience this morning highlighted some significant gaps in our system. But more importantly, it's brought attention to a larger issue in medical transportation services. He slid a document across his desk. It was a draft of a new policy requiring all medical transport services contracted by the hospital to undergo comprehensive anti-bias training. Additionally, the hospital would be partnering with other major medical institutions to create an industry-wide standard for medical transport services. We'd like you to be part of the committee developing these standards, Dr. Thompson said. Your experience, both today and throughout your career, could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Richardson considered the offer carefully. She thought about all the times she'd had to prove herself beyond what was asked of others, about the young doctors she mentored who shared similar stories, and about the changes that could be made if institutions finally acknowledged these issues formally. I'll do it, she agreed, but my surgical schedule remains my priority. Dr. Thompson nodded, understanding that her dedication to her patients would always come first. As if to emphasize this point, a nurse knocked on the door. Amy had woken up, and her parents had requested Dr. Richardson's presence. Walking back to the pediatric recovery ward, Dr. Richardson reflected on how a day that had started with such frustration was ending with promise, not just for little Amy, who was already showing signs of strong recovery, but for all the medical professionals who might benefit from the changes being set in motion. In Amy's room, the young girl's eyes fluttered open as Dr. Richardson checked her vitals. Despite the gravity of the surgery she'd just undergone, Amy managed a small smile. It was moments like these that reminded Dr. Richardson why she had persevered through every obstacle in her path, because at the end of the day, it was all about the lives she could help save. 2 weeks after the incident at Teterboro Airport, Captain Robert Walsh sat in his company's HR office, staring at the screen displaying a viral social media post. The post, which had garnered millions of views, detailed the experience of a black female neurosurgeon being questioned about her credentials before a critical emergency flight. Though names weren't mentioned, he knew exactly who had written it. One of Dr. Richardson's colleagues, with her permission, had shared the story. The comments section was filled with similar stories from medical professionals across the country. What struck him most were the accounts from other pilots and flight crews, sharing how they had learned to check their own biases and create more welcoming environments for all passengers. Captain Walsh, the HR director, began, her voice firm but not unkind. We've reviewed the incident thoroughly. While your service record has been exemplary until now, this situation requires more than a simple disciplinary action. We're implementing changes across our entire organization. Rather than termination, which Walsh had feared, the company had decided on a different approach. They wanted him to be part of the solution. The airline was partnering with Johns Hopkins and other major hospitals to develop new training protocols for medical transport services, and they needed input from experienced pilots who understood the importance of both safety protocols and respectful treatment of passengers. Meanwhile, at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Richardson's schedule remained as busy as ever. Amy Chen's recovery was exceeding expectations. The young girl was already sitting up in bed, chatting animatedly with her nurses and working with physical therapists. Her case was becoming a testament to the importance of having the right surgeon at the right time, regardless of any preconceptions about what that surgeon might look like. One morning, as Dr. Richardson completed her rounds, she received an unexpected email. The airline company was requesting her participation in their new training program development. They wanted her to share her perspective, not just about the incident, but about her entire career experience with medical transport services. The email included an unexpected detail. Captain Walsh had specifically requested her involvement, stating that his experience had opened his eyes to the need for systematic change. He wanted to ensure that no other medical professional would face similar obstacles while trying to save lives. Dr. Richardson considered the request carefully. Her schedule was already packed with surgeries, research, and the hospital's own initiative to address transportation inequities. But she recognized the potential impact of collaborating with those willing to learn and change. She drafted her response during a rare quiet moment between surgeries. While the incident was unfortunate, I believe the most productive path forward is to work together to prevent similar situations. I'm willing to participate in your training development, with the understanding that this is about creating lasting institutional change. The following week, Dr. Richardson found herself in a conference room with an unusual mix of people: airline executives, medical administrators, pilots including Captain Walsh, and other medical professionals who had faced similar experiences. The atmosphere was initially tense, but as people began sharing their stories and perspectives, the tension gave way to productive dialogue. Captain Walsh spoke up during one session, his voice carrying the weight of genuine reflection. "I've been flying medical transport for 15 years, he said. I always prided myself on maintaining the highest standards of safety and professionalism. But that morning showed me that what I thought was professional caution was actually something else entirely. We need to do better." As the discussion continued, Dr. Richardson shared insights from her years of experience, not just about transportation issues, but about the broader challenges faced by medical professionals who didn't fit traditional expectations. She spoke about mentoring young doctors who worried about facing similar situations, about the extra time and energy spent proving oneself beyond what was asked of others, and about how all of this ultimately affected patient care. The impact of these discussions began to ripple outward. Other airlines and medical transport services started reaching out, asking to be part of the developing protocols. Medical schools expressed interest in incorporating similar training into their programs. What had started as a single incident was catalyzing industry-wide change. Back at the hospital, Amy Chen was preparing for discharge. Her parents had learned about the incident that had nearly delayed their daughter's surgery, and Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes as she thanked Dr. Richardson not just for saving Amy's life, but for pushing through barriers to do so. "You know," Mrs. Chen said softly, watching Amy color in her hospital bed, "Amy told me she wants to be a doctor like you when she grows up. Not just a doctor, she specifically said she wants to be one who helps change things for the better." Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams and the mentors who had helped her achieve them. "Tell Amy that being a doctor is about more than just medicine," she replied. "It's about making sure everyone has access to the care they need, when they need it." As she completed Amy's discharge paperwork, Dr. Richardson received another email, this time from a young medical student who had read about the incident. The student wrote about how the story had given her courage to continue pursuing her dreams despite facing similar prejudices. Attached was a photo of her study group, a diverse collection of future doctors all inspired by Dr. Richardson's story. That evening, as Dr. Richardson prepared for her next day's surgeries, she reflected on how a challenging moment had transformed into an opportunity for widespread change. The incident could have remained just another frustrating experience, filed away with others she had faced throughout her career. Instead, it had become a catalyst for examination and improvement across multiple industries. Captain Walsh had requested to meet with her personally, outside of the training sessions. His message indicated he wanted to apologize properly and learn more about her journey in medicine. While some might have declined, Dr. Richardson understood the value of such conversations in creating real change. She agreed to the meeting, recognizing that progress often began with individual transformations before spreading to institutions. The coffee shop near Johns Hopkins was quiet that Saturday morning when Dr. Richardson arrived for her meeting with Captain Walsh. She had chosen this location deliberately, neutral ground, away from both the hospital and the airport, where they could have an honest conversation without the weight of their professional environments. Captain Walsh was already there, having arrived early out of nervousness. He stood as she approached, his demeanor markedly different from their first encounter. Gone was the dismissive authority, in its place was a man who had spent weeks reflecting on his actions and their broader implications. "Dr. Richardson," he began, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They settled into their seats, the morning sunlight streaming through the window creating a warm, open atmosphere that seemed to encourage candid discussion. "You know," Dr. Richardson said, stirring her coffee, "when I first received your request to meet, I wasn't sure if it would be worthwhile. But then I thought about all the times change happened because people were willing to have difficult conversations." Walsh nodded, his hands wrapped around his own cup. "I've been in aviation for over 20 years, he started. I've prided myself on maintaining the highest safety standards, following protocols to the letter. But that morning showed me how blind spots can masquerade as professional caution." As they talked, Dr. Richardson shared stories from her journey through medical school and residency. She spoke about mentors who had believed in her, colleagues who had supported her, and others who had created obstacles based on their own preconceptions. Walsh listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest in understanding her experiences. "The hardest part," she explained, "isn't the obvious barriers. It's the subtle ones, the constant need to prove yourself beyond what's asked of others, the energy spent managing people's assumptions before you can even begin your actual work." Walsh shared his own journey of realization over the past weeks. He had been reviewing his past interactions with passengers, recognizing patterns he had never noticed before. "The training sessions have opened my eyes," he admitted. "But hearing your story directly, understanding the impact of those small moments of doubt or dismissal, it's different when you see the human cost." Their conversation was interrupted by a text message on Dr. Richardson's phone, a photo from Mrs. Chen showing Amy at her first day back at school, her bright smile showing no trace of her recent surgery. Dr. Richardson showed the photo to Walsh. "This is why that morning mattered so much," she said quietly. "Every delay, every obstacle put in front of medical professionals like me, potentially affects someone's child, parent, or loved one." The impact of her words was visible on Walsh's face. He had known, intellectually, that his actions had nearly delayed an emergency surgery. But seeing the actual child whose life had hung in the balance made it viscerally real. As their meeting continued, they discussed the changes being implemented across the medical transport industry. Walsh shared how the training program they were developing had already begun to transform the culture among flight crews. Pilots were having open discussions about their own biases, sharing stories of times they might have made assumptions about passengers based on appearance. "Last week," Walsh recounted, "one of our newer pilots came to me for advice. He had caught himself making assumptions about a passenger's credentials and stopped himself before acting on them. He wanted to know how to better check his initial reactions." Dr. Richardson nodded, recognizing the importance of these small but significant shifts in awareness. That's how real change happens, she observed. Not just through formal policies, but through individual moments of recognition and choice. The conversation shifted to the broader impact their story had created. Medical institutions across the country were reviewing their transportation protocols. Other industries were reaching out to learn from the training program being developed. What had started as a tense encounter at Teterboro was catalyzing discussions about professional bias in unexpected places. "My daughter read about what happened," Walsh shared unexpectedly. "She's in medical school now. She told me she's seen similar situations during her clinical rotations, qualified professionals being questioned or dismissed based on appearance. It made me realize how these patterns perpetuate themselves unless we actively work to break them." As their meeting drew to a close, Dr. Richardson received another message, this time from Dr. Thompson. The hospital board had unanimously approved the new transportation protocols they had been developing. Additionally, they were establishing a mentorship program for medical students and residents, specifically addressing the challenges of navigating professional environments where they might face similar prejudices. "You know what the most powerful part of this whole experience has been?" Dar. Richardson asked, gathering her things. "It's not just about preventing negative encounters. It's about creating systems that actively support and empower all qualified professionals to do their best work." Walsh stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn and grow from this," he said sincerely. "I know it wasn't your responsibility to educate me, but I'm grateful you chose to engage in this dialogue." Dr. Richardson shook his hand, recognizing the genuine transformation in the man who had once dismissed her credentials. "Change happens one conversation at a time," she replied. "What matters is what we do with the insights we gain." As they parted ways, both knew that their conversation would inform the ongoing developments in their respective fields. Walsh would take these insights back to his role in training other pilots, while Dr. Richardson would continue her work both in the operating room and in shaping institutional policies. The following week, when Dr. Richardson boarded another medical transport flight, this time for a conference where she would be speaking about both neurosurgical advances and professional equity in medicine, she noticed a subtle but significant difference in how the flight crew interacted with her. There was a new awareness, a conscious effort to create an environment of respect and recognition for all passengers, regardless of their appearance. It was a small change, but it represented the beginning of a larger transformation. As Dr. Richardson settled into her seat, she smiled, knowing that somewhere, another professional might be having an easier journey because of the difficult conversations that had started that morning at Teterboro. 3 months after the Teterboro incident, the auditorium at Johns Hopkins Medical Center was filled to capacity. Medical professionals, airline executives, and transportation industry leaders had gathered for the first symposium on excellence in medical transport, breaking barriers and building trust. Dr. Richardson sat in the front row, watching as Captain Walsh delivered the opening address. "When I started flying medical transport missions 20 years ago," Walsh began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "I thought I understood what professional excellence meant. It took one morning, one encounter, and one extraordinary doctor to show me how much I still had to learn." The audience listened intently as Walsh shared how the training program, developed in collaboration with Dr. Richardson and other medical professionals, had already begun transforming the industry. Over 50 medical transport companies had adopted the new protocols, and early feedback showed promising results. Dr. Richardson's thoughts drifted to her most recent emergency flight, just a week earlier. The difference had been striking. From the moment she'd arrived at the terminal, there had been a new level of professionalism and respect that went beyond mere courtesy. The focus had been entirely on getting her to her patient as quickly and efficiently as possible. As Walsh concluded his speech, Dr. Thompson took the stage to present the preliminary results of their initiative. The data was compelling. incidents of credential questioning had decreased by 78% across participating companies, while efficiency in emergency medical transport had improved by 23%. But numbers only tell part of the story, Dr. Thompson added, gesturing to the side of the stage. We have someone here who can speak to the human impact of these changes. To Dr. Richardson's surprise, Amy Chen walked onto the stage with her parents, looking healthy and vibrant. The audience broke into applause as the young girl approached the microphone, her voice clear and confident. Dr. Richardson saved my life, Amy began, but she almost didn't get the chance because someone didn't believe she could be a famous doctor. She paused, looking directly at the audience. I'm better now, and I'm still going to be a doctor when I grow up. And I want to help make sure other doctors like Dr. Richardson can help their patients without having to prove themselves first. The simplicity and power of Amy's words left many in the audience visibly moved. Dr. Richardson felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched this young girl, who had faced such serious medical challenges, now standing as a symbol of why their work mattered. After Amy's speech, the symposium broke into smaller sessions, each addressing different aspects of the initiative. Dr. Richardson led a discussion on maintaining medical excellence while implementing new protocols. The room was packed with young medical professionals eager to learn from her experience. The goal isn't just to prevent discrimination, she explained to the attentive audience. It's to create an environment where every qualified professional can focus entirely on what matters most, patient care. In another session, Captain Walsh worked with other pilots and flight crews, addressing the subtle ways bias could affect decision-making. They reviewed real-world scenarios, discussing how to maintain safety protocols while eliminating unnecessary barriers. During the lunch break, Dr. Richardson found herself sitting with a group of medical residents from diverse backgrounds. They shared their own experiences, but with a new sense of hope. One resident spoke about how the widely publicized changes had already impacted her daily work. Last week, she said, I was rushing to an emergency consultation. The security guard who used to always stop me just held the door open instead. It was such a small thing, but it meant I could focus completely on my patient. The afternoon sessions focused on expanding the initiative beyond medical transport. Representatives from other industries, law enforcement, education, corporate leadership, were there to learn how similar protocols could be adapted for their fields. Dr. Richardson was particularly moved by a presentation from a police department that had already begun implementing similar training. They shared body camera footage showing officers actively working to check their assumptions during high-stress situations, leading to better outcomes for everyone involved. As the day drew to a close, Dr. Richardson was asked to deliver the final address. Standing at the podium, looking out at the diverse faces in the audience, she felt the weight of the moment. 3 months ago, I was just trying to reach a patient who needed surgery, she began. I never expected that morning to become a catalyst for such widespread change. But that's often how progress works. One incident, one conversation, one person willing to learn and grow, can start a chain reaction. She gestured to Captain Walsh in the audience. What makes this initiative different is that we're not just talking about change, we're actively creating it. We're showing that when we remove unnecessary barriers, everyone benefits. Patients receive better care. Professionals can focus fully on their work. And organizations operate more efficiently. The applause that followed her speech was interrupted by breaking news on everyone's phones. Another major airline had just announced they were adopting the training protocols. The momentum was building. After the symposium, Dr. Richardson found herself in her office, reviewing the day's events. On her desk was a stack of letters from medical professionals around the country, sharing how the changes had affected their work. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was from a young doctor who had faced a similar situation just days after the Teterboro incident went public. The difference was, the letter read, when I showed my credentials, the pilot immediately apologized for questioning them. He mentioned the training he'd just completed and thanked me for my patience. I made it to my patient on time, and that made all the difference." As she prepared to leave for the day, Dr. Richardson received a video call from Amy Chen, excited to share her experience of speaking at the symposium. The young girl's enthusiasm was infectious as she talked about wanting to start a club at her school to encourage other kids interested in medicine. "You know what the best part was?" Amy asked, her eyes bright. "When I was speaking, I saw some of the pilots crying. I think they really understood why it's so important to let doctors do their job." Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering her own journey and the mentors who had supported her along the way. The changes they were implementing now would make that journey easier for the next generation of medical professionals, for young people like Amy, who deserve to be judged solely on their abilities and dedication. 6 months after the Teterboro incident, Dr. Richardson found herself standing in a very different kind of venue, the main hall of the National Academy of Sciences. She had been invited to deliver a keynote address about the transformative changes that had swept through the medical transport industry and beyond. The morning sun streamed through the historic building's windows as she prepared her presentation. Just before taking the stage, she received a text message that made her smile, a photo from Amy Chen showing off her science fair project about brain surgery, complete with a first-place ribbon. "Good morning," Dr. Richardson began, addressing the packed auditorium. "6 months ago, I was simply a surgeon trying to reach a patient. Today, I'm here to share how one incident sparked a movement that has transformed not just medical transport, but professional environments across multiple industries." The presentation screen behind her displayed impressive statistics. Over 200 organizations had now adopted versions of the training program. Workplace incident reports showed significant decreases in bias-related complaints, and most importantly, emergency medical response times had improved by an average of 15 minutes. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," she continued, clicking to the next slide, a collection of photographs showing diverse professionals in various fields. "These are the real measures of our success." She pointed to one photo showing a young female pilot helping a senior physician board a medical transport plane. Captain Walsh, who many of you know from his role in developing our initial training program, took this picture last month. The pilot in the photo was one of our first training graduates. The physician later wrote to tell us it was the first time in her 30-year career that she hadn't faced any questioning about her credentials. In the audience, Captain Walsh nodded, remembering how far they'd come. He had recently been promoted to Director of Professional Development at his airline, where he was implementing even more comprehensive training programs. Dr. Richardson continued, sharing stories from different sectors. A major tech company had adapted their protocols for their hiring process. A law enforcement agency had modified their emergency response procedures. Universities were incorporating similar training into their professional development programs. But perhaps the most meaningful change, she said, clicking to a new slide, is happening in our schools. The screen showed a classroom where Amy Chen was giving a presentation to her peers about careers in medicine. This is where real, lasting transformation begins. During the Q&A session that followed, a reporter raised his hand. "Dr. Richardson, there are critics who say these changes are just superficial, that they don't address deeper systemic issues. How do you respond to that?" Dr. Richardson thoughtfully considered the question. "Change happens in layers," she replied. "Yes, there are deeper issues that still need addressing. But when we create environments where every qualified professional can focus entirely on their work without fighting unnecessary battles, we build the foundation for addressing those deeper challenges." After the presentation, Dr. Richardson met with a group of medical students who had been inspired by her story. Among them was Captain Walsh's daughter, now in her final year of medical school. "Your experience changed my father," she told Dr. Richardson. "And through him, it's changing so many others. Last week, during my emergency medicine rotation, I watched a senior physician stop someone from questioning a colleague's credentials. She referenced your story and the new protocols. It's becoming part of our professional culture." Later that afternoon, Dr. Richardson participated in a panel discussion with leaders from various industries. The conversation focused on how the principles developed from the Medical Transport Initiative could be adapted for different professional contexts. A tech industry CEO shared how they had revamped their customer service protocols after learning about the initiative. "We realized we had similar issues with our technical support teams," she explained. Female engineers were constantly being asked to prove their expertise. "We implemented similar training, and our customer satisfaction scores have actually improved." A police chief described how their adapted version of the training had led to better community relations. "When our officers learned to check their initial assumptions," he said, "we saw immediate improvements in our emergency response effectiveness." During a break between sessions, Dr. Richardson received an unexpected call from Mrs. Chen. Amy had been invited to speak at her school district's career day about her experience as a patient and her dreams of becoming a doctor. "She keeps telling everyone that doctors can look like anybody," Mrs. Chen said, her voice full of emotion. "She says she learned that from you." The day concluded with a roundtable discussion about the future of professional equity initiatives. Dr. Richardson found herself sitting next to a familiar face, the airline CEO who had first approved the training program after the Teterboro incident. "You know," he said during a quiet moment, "when this first happened, we were worried about potential liability issues. But what we've gained in terms of operational efficiency and employee satisfaction has far exceeded our expectations. It turns out, removing unnecessary barriers isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business." As the event wound down, Dr. Richardson checked her schedule for the next day. She had 3 surgeries planned, followed by a mentoring session with residents. The work of saving lives continued, but now with fewer obstacles in the way. On her drive home, she passed a billboard for the airline company. Their new slogan read, "Supporting excellence in every form." It was a small thing, but it represented a significant shift in corporate messaging. That evening, as she prepared for the next day's surgeries, Dr. Richardson reflected on how far they'd come. The incident at Teterboro could have remained just another frustrating experience in her career. Instead, it had become a catalyst for genuine change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Walsh. He had just finished conducting a training session with a new group of pilots. "One of them asked me today why these changes took so long," he wrote. "I told them what you always say, that progress happens when we're willing to learn from our mistakes and take action to prevent them from happening again." Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering that tense morning at Teterboro that now felt like a lifetime ago. Tomorrow, somewhere, a professional would be able to focus entirely on their work without having to prove they belonged there. And that, she knew, was worth every effort they had made to create change. 1 year after the Teterboro incident, Dr. Richardson stood in the newly dedicated Professional Excellence Center at Johns Hopkins. The center, inspired by the changes that had begun with her experience, was designed to be a hub for research and training in professional equity across all industries. The morning light filtered through the building's modern glass walls as she watched a group of medical students gathering for their first training session. Among them was a familiar face, Amy Chen's older sister, Lisa, now in her first year of medical school, inspired by her sister's experience and Dr. Richardson's influence. "Dr. Richardson," Lisa called out, approaching with a tablet in hand. "I wanted to show you something before the session starts." She pulled up a video of Amy, now fully recovered and standing before her middle school class, delivering a presentation about women in medicine. "My sister's surgery wasn't just about fixing something in her brain," Amy's voice rang clear through the tablet's speakers. "It was about showing me that anyone can be anything if they're given the chance to prove themselves." The training session that morning was part of a new curriculum developed from the lessons learned over the past year. Dr. Richardson watched as Captain Walsh, now a regular guest instructor, shared his perspective with the students. "Understanding bias isn't just about avoiding mistakes," he explained to the attentive audience. "It's about creating environments where excellence can flourish without artificial barriers." Every time we let assumptions cloud our judgment, we risk losing valuable contributions to our fields. During the session, a student raised her hand to share a recent experience from her clinical rotations. "Last week, a patient assumed I was a nurse," she said. "Before I could respond, the attending physician, who had gone through this training, stepped in and handled the situation perfectly. He educated the patient without making anyone uncomfortable." Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering how many similar situations she had faced in her early career. The difference now was that institutions were actively working to address these issues rather than expecting individuals to navigate them alone. After the session, Dr. Richardson met with representatives from a major technology company. They had adapted the training protocols for their industry and were seeing remarkable results. "Our female engineers reported a 60% decrease in credential questioning during client meetings," the company's HR director shared. "But what really surprised us was the improvement in team productivity. When people can focus on their work instead of proving they belong there, everyone benefits." Later that afternoon, Dr. Richardson received an unexpected visitor, the daughter of a patient she had operated on recently. The young woman had flown in from Seattle after hearing about the Professional Excellence Center. "My mother's surgery was successful," she began, "but what really struck me was how different the medical transport experience was from what I'd heard about before. The pilot and crew were incredibly professional, focused entirely on getting mom to you as quickly as possible. No questions, no doubts, just excellence in action." As they talked, Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with a notification. The state legislature had just passed a bill requiring all licensed medical transport services to implement comprehensive anti-bias training. The legislation, nicknamed the Richardson-Walsh Act, had received bipartisan support. The day continued with a virtual conference connecting similar initiatives across the country. On screens around the room, professionals from various fields shared their experiences implementing the training protocols. A female fire chief from Chicago described how their adapted program had improved emergency response times. A Silicon Valley startup founder talked about building inclusive practices into their company culture from the ground up. A medical transport pilot from Texas shared how the training had changed his entire approach to his work. During a break, Dr. Richardson checked in with Amy Chen, who was preparing for a national science competition. The young girl's project focused on the intersection of neuroscience and social change, inspired by her own experience. "Guess what, Dr. Richardson?" Amy exclaimed excitedly. "Captain Walsh's granddaughter is in my science club now. We're working on a project together about how fast decisions affect medical outcomes." The connection between these two families, once linked by a tense incident, now represented the kind of positive change they were working to create. Captain Walsh's granddaughter and Amy had become friends, their shared interest in medicine bridging any divide that might have existed. As evening approached, Dr. Richardson participated in a panel discussion about the future of professional equity. The auditorium was packed with professionals from various fields, all eager to learn from the past year's experiences. "The key lesson," she explained to the audience, "isn't just about preventing discrimination. It's about creating systems that actively support excellence in all its forms. When we remove unnecessary barriers, we don't just help individuals, we enhance entire professions." A question from the audience caught her attention: "How do you measure success in these initiatives?" Dr. Richardson thought for a moment before responding. "We measure it in minutes saved during emergency responses. In lives touched by professionals who can focus fully on their work. In young people who can dream without limitation. But mostly, we measure it in the stories we don't hear anymore, the incidents that don't happen because we've created better systems." After the panel, Dr. Richardson met with a group of international healthcare representatives interested in implementing similar programs globally. The ripple effects of that morning at Teterboro had spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. As she prepared to leave for the day, she received one more surprise, a letter from the pilot who had initially questioned her credentials. He had retired from flying but was now working full-time in professional development, helping other industries implement similar training programs. "Your grace in handling that situation," he wrote, "didn't just change my perspective, it showed me how to help others change theirs." Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important contributions. Looking out over the campus as the sun set, Dr. Richardson reflected on how a moment of confrontation had transformed into a movement for positive change. The Professional Excellence Center stood as a testament to what could happen when people chose to learn and grow from challenging experiences. Her phone buzzed one last time, a message from Mrs. Chen with a photo of Amy's science project display. The title read, "Breaking Barriers, Building Excellence, How One Morning Changed Medicine." Below it was a quote, "Sometimes the most important surgical tool is the change we create in others' minds." 18 months after the Teterboro incident, Dr. Richardson stood at the podium of the National Medical Achievement Awards ceremony. The prestigious event, traditionally focused on medical breakthroughs, had added a new category: transformative impact in healthcare access and delivery. The audience represented a cross-section of the medical community and beyond: healthcare professionals, airline executives, policymakers, and advocates for change. In the front row sat Amy Chen, now a confident 8th grader, alongside her family. Next to them was Captain Walsh, his presence a testament to how far they'd come from that tense morning at Teterboro. "When I entered medical school," Dr. Richardson began, "I dreamed of saving lives through surgical innovation. I never imagined that one of the most significant impacts I'd have on healthcare would come from an incident that almost prevented me from reaching a patient." She gestured to a large screen behind her, which displayed a series of statistics. Emergency medical transport response times had improved by 27% nationwide, credential verification delays had decreased by 85%, and patient outcomes in time-sensitive cases had shown measurable improvement. "But the real story isn't in these numbers," she continued. "It's in the lives touched, the barriers broken, and the culture we're creating together." The screen shifted to show a video compilation. It began with news footage from the day after the Teterboro incident, followed by clips showing the development of the training program, the opening of the Professional Excellence Center, and testimonials from professionals across various industries. One clip showed Amy Chen speaking at a national youth medical conference. "Because Dr. Richardson made it to my surgery that day," the young girl said confidently, "I'm not just alive, I'm inspired. And I'm not the only one." The video cut to scenes from medical transport facilities across the country, where new protocols and training programs had become standard practice. Pilots, doctors, and other professionals shared their experiences of how the changes had improved their ability to serve patients effectively. "What started as one incident has become a movement," Dr. Richardson explained. "But movements don't succeed because of single moments or individuals. They succeed because people choose to learn, grow, and create lasting change." She acknowledged Captain Walsh in the audience. "Some of our strongest advocates for change are those who once participated in the systems we needed to improve. Their willingness to learn and lead by example has been crucial to our success." The presentation continued with updates from various initiatives that had grown from the original training program. A major hospital network had implemented a comprehensive professional equity program. Medical schools had incorporated the training into their core curriculum. Even international healthcare organizations had begun adopting similar protocols. "But perhaps the most meaningful change," Dr. Richardson said, gesturing to a group of young people in the audience, "is happening with our next generation of medical professionals." The camera focused on a diverse group of medical students, including Lisa Chen and Captain Walsh's daughter, now in their advanced medical training. They were part of the first class to go through the new integrated curriculum that combined medical excellence with professional equity training. "These students will never know a medical environment where they have to constantly prove they belong," Dr. Richardson continued. "They can focus entirely on what matters most, providing excellent care to their patients." The ceremony took an unexpected turn when Amy Chen was invited to the stage. She carried with her a thick binder, a collection of letters from young people inspired by the changes they'd witnessed. "Dear Dr. Richardson," Amy read from one letter, "I used to think I couldn't be a doctor because no one in my family looked like the doctors I saw. But your story showed me that excellence doesn't have a specific look. I'm now in my first year of pre-med." The impact of these words was visible on every face in the audience. This wasn't just about removing barriers, it was about inspiring future generations to dream bigger and reach higher. After the ceremony, Dr. Richardson found herself surrounded by a group of international healthcare representatives. They shared stories of how the training program had been adapted for different cultural contexts while maintaining its core principles. "In our country," one delegate explained, "we've seen a 40% increase in women entering emergency medicine since implementing these protocols. The ripple effects are touching lives we never expected to reach." Later that evening, at a small gathering of key figures from the initiative's journey, Captain Walsh shared some news. His airline had just promoted its first female chief of medical transport operations, the same pilot who had been one of the first graduates of their training program. "She's already implementing new improvements to the protocols," he said proudly. "The next generation isn't just maintaining the changes we started, they're building upon them." Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. A young patient needed emergency surgery, and a medical transport was being arranged. The message included a note, "All protocols in place, clear pathway established. Estimated arrival time 20 minutes faster than previous standard." As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Richardson found a quiet moment with Amy Chen, who was eager to share her latest achievement. She had started a STEM mentorship program at her school, pairing middle school students with medical professionals from diverse backgrounds. "You know what's different now?" Amy asked thoughtfully. "When I tell people I want to be a neurosurgeon, no one questions whether I can do it. They just ask what kind of surgeon I want to be." The next morning, Dr. Richardson arrived at Teterboro Airport for another emergency flight. The contrast with that morning 18 months ago couldn't have been starker. The professional efficiency of the staff, the clarity of the protocols, the focus on getting her to her patient, everything reflected the changes they had worked so hard to implement. As she boarded the plane, the pilot, a young woman, greeted her with simple professional courtesy. No questions about credentials, no doubts about authority. Just one healthcare professional helping another do their job. Looking out the window as they took off, Dr. Richardson reflected on how far they'd come. The incident that could have been just another frustrating moment in her career had instead become a catalyst for lasting change. But more importantly, it had shown that when people are willing to learn from their mistakes and work together, real transformation is possible. The plane rose through the morning clouds, carrying her toward another patient who needed her skills. Below, the sun was rising on a medical landscape that looked very different from 18 months ago, one where excellence could flourish in all its forms, unhindered by unnecessary barriers. And somewhere in Baltimore, a young girl named Amy Chen was starting her school day, dreaming of the surgeon she would become, knowing that the path ahead, while still challenging, was clearer because of those who had helped pave the way.